What do you know about lipids, right? Well, first thing you see here, you know butter and oil is chock full of lipids, right? What else do you know? So lipids are a diverse group. They are your fats, your phospholipids, your steroids, your waxes. And it's like, whoa, what do these things have in common? What they have in common is that they are all insoluble in water. Okay, so they are hydrophobic, they do not like water, and you'll notice if you ever mix oil and water that the oil seems to clump together within the water and it doesn't ever mix. Okay, so remember those hydrocarbon chains here. So these are long nonpolar hydrocarbon chains just bound together, making this large macromolecule. And each one of these types of lipids has its own characteristics, but they all, remember, if ever asked, they all share that one characteristic. So when you talk about your fats, these are your triglycerides or your triacylglycerides. This tri is important here, okay? So tri means 3. So you have this glycerol with these 3 fatty acids to form this triglycerol. And this is largely what makes up our fats. There are several types. So you can have this is what makes up our fatty acids. And you can have several types. So the saturated means that there's a bunch of single bonds here and that every carbon has a hydrogen attached to it, or a single bond. If it's unsaturated, it can be monounsaturated, so one unsaturation or many unsaturations, and that unsaturation is introduced by having these double bonds, okay? So having a double bond is how you have a unsaturated fat. So here you see each carbon only forms a single bond with any given molecule in the chain, okay? So this doesn't apply to the head of the molecule. But here within this tail, you see you have this double bond. So this is monounsaturated. There's one double bond in the chain. And here you have a polysaccharide where there's 2 double bonds in the chain. So what's interesting here is that usually this is the difference between fat that's solid at room temperature versus liquid at room temperature. Okay, so the more unsaturated it is, the more fluid those tails are. The more saturated it is, the more stacked they can be. Okay, so you can stack these together. Here you see this is fat. This is going to be solid fat with saturated fatty acids, where it tends to be oily when it's unsaturated. The next class is phospholipids. This should sound vaguely familiar to you. So our phospholipids are what makes up the membrane of our cells, okay? So that double phospholipid layer. And so here you have a glycerol. Now you only have 2 fatty acids, and you have a phosphate, which gives you that phospho of the lipids, okay? So here's our phosphate group. Here's 1 fatty acid, 2 fatty acids. This gives it a polar and a nonpolar end, okay? So one end of it likes water, whereas there's a part that doesn't. And so the ones that don't like water tend to interact with each other. So in this bilayer, they're facing the opposite direction so that the hydrophilic ends can interact with the water that's largely made up in our cell, and the hydrophobic ends can hide out in the middle. Okay. And I think I touched on all of those. And this is a membrane here. And so you see the polar heads on the outside and the nonpolar tails on the inside. Then you have your steroids, okay? And you're familiar with what these steroids are. So these are hormones within our body. They all have this classic 4-ring structure, and then they can have some other out groups on there, or some R groups, okay? Now, but these steroids are what makes up our hormones. So here we have, this is the typical template or skeleton of them, and then you see there's different things going on to make them each molecule that they are. So cholesterol is a steroid. Cholesterol is a component of our phospholipid bilayer. Then you have your sexual hormones, so your sex hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and progesterone, and then some others including cortisone and aldosterone. Now, the last class of lipids are these waxes. So these are these long chains of fatty acids attached to hydrocarbon chains. Okay? So they resemble fatty acids. They resemble the triglycerides we talked about, but they're only two and they can be more complicated. Okay? Now, our waxes are important. So when you think about waxes, one, we know that they have to be hydrophilic, but the other thing is like these tend to coat things, right? So the leaves have a waxy coat on them to help keep the water out. You can put wax in your hair and things to retain that water. So waxes tend to coat things to keep the water from getting in and messing them up. Okay, so here's the coat on the plants, and then here's our beeswax. So, if I said, hey, quick review, what's the difference between a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid? You should be able to answer that. Or, what similarity does all triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids, and waxes have in common? You should know that by now. And then what's different between all of them, which is also a given. So they're a very diverse group. They have one thing in common and then a lot of things that are not in common. Okay? So when we talk about this being like the food community, like what are those trans fats? So if you think in terms of looking at labels and it says no trans fatness, what does that even mean, right? This means it was artificially created in a way. It was manipulated. We'll go with that term. We'll call it manipulated. So you take a polyunsaturated fat, so a fat that has a lot of these double bonds in them, and you break those double bonds. Okay, so it's like you're forcing this unsaturated fat to become saturated. But what you're really doing is hydrogenating it. You're breaking those bonds and adding back those hydrogens. Okay, this is not good for you, right? So those trans fats, you find them in your fast foods, in your fried foods, in margarine, in baked goods, and things that have been manipulated. Okay, so you break those bonds and force hydrogens on them. So you make this polyunsaturated into artificially hydrogenated saturated fats. Trans fats and saturated fats are bad for you. They've both been linked to cardiovascular diseases of the cardiovascular system, which includes your heart and your blood vessels. What they do is they coat. So you see how you say, oh, so-and-so had a heart attack or so. What that means is the blood couldn't flow efficiently through those vessels. And this is usually by the buildup of these bad fats. Whereas on the flip side, those unsaturated fats, which are oils, tend to be protected. So you see like omega-3 fish oils and olive oils and canola oils are better for you than other oils. And they tend to be more protective against heart disease. What exactly they do, I'm not sure. But I know that they are good for you and trans and saturated are bad for you. And here are your omega-3 fatty acids. So you'll see that there are a lot of supplements in this. So you can eat fish to get these oils. Certain fishes are high in them, so your salmons and your sardines. Or you can take these supplements to get the benefits of them. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns about lipids? Write it down, bring it to class. Let's talk about it.